Hello, everyone. Just wanted to say a few words as we begin the third unit or third week of the course, where we'll be taking a deeper look at utilitarianism. Um, First of all, I think the way that you should conceive of what you need to do this week is along the same lines of last week. You're reading, and you're reading in preparation for taking an exam, just as you were with Kant. And just as last week, there are a couple of sets of review questions or study questions. I call them interchangeably review questions or study questions. I don't know why I do that. But, and also videos for all the readings. And also, I will be sending out, as I did for Kant, review videos for the review questions or study questions. So you'll be looking for those. But we're reading John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, at least the first four chapters of it, in preparation for an exam, uh, beginning of the week after on the material. In some ways, utilitarianism is much simpler than Kant. And in some ways, especially since we're reading John Stuart Mill, it's not it's not as easy to put your finger on, I would say. Just what the procedure is. Kant can be difficult to read, but I think when we come out of it, we come out of it with a definite ethical decision making framework. And we get very specific instructions, I think, or at least it's very clear, I believe, what we need to do to apply Kantian principles to a situation to come up with some sort of answer. And that is the application of the first and second categorical imperatives. And it's pretty, I mean, whether we're Kantians or not, whether we think the kind of answers that this decision making framework gives us are good answers, that's another question. But as far as the actual application of it, I think it's fairly precise, or it's fairly clear. It's not so clear with utilitarianism. I mean, at the heart of utilitarianism is what Mill calls the greatest happiness principle slash principle of utility. And that is that, good and bad or good and evil are defined there as in terms of how they impact on human happiness. So what we have is a results-based or consequentialist moral philosophy. Whatever an action is or whatever prompts it really doesn't matter so much. What matters are the consequences. What matters are the results, the impacts, and the impacts that matter are the impacts on human happiness. But how exactly we're supposed to go about applying that to a specific situation, it's not as well defined as in Kant. One of the things that I'm trying to do in these little video talks and things is to maybe nail that down or to specify that a little more. So the first thing I want to be clear is that the reading is all contained in the first length, which is just a PDF of the whole book, of an edition of Mill's Utilitarianism. So yes, I've broken up the readings insofar as I put the page numbers, chapter numbers, page numbers, but the entire reading is here in this PDF, and then we'll just read the specific chapters. Just download the PDF, and you'll see what I mean. So that should be self-explanatory. Let's face it. Okay, you got that covered, right? Yeah. So the whole reading of Mill's book, or all the readings, are in that initial link for the PDF to the whole book, and then reading one, there's nothing there. There's no. It's just a little title or header to tell you which chapter to read and which pages of the chapter to read if we're breaking it up. So the reading is the book, the PDF of the scan of the whole book, which is in the first length. And then I've just broken it up into specific readings. Readings 1 and 2 are basically chapter 1, and then the first part of chapter 2, and then we have videos and review questions, and then again, it's all here in the first link. So we're reading most of the first four chapters, I believe, of Mill's book, and it's a more wide ranging thing than Kant. I mean, Mill is a different sort of philosopher, but I think more importantly, he has different sorts of interest. Kant, in his larger work, was very engaged with the history of his time and the politics and current events, but not in his philosophical work, not in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, which we were looking at last week. Whereas Mill is clearly more engaged in in this book in the politics or the social transformations of his time, and he is as much a kind of a political thinker as he's utilitarian as an ethical thinker. He wants to transform society. You'll see this. But there are a few points, philosophical points, that I think are highlighted. I hopefully highlighted in the videos. The big thesis from Mill, as we'll see, is that he has defined the good, which is pleasure. He has said that anything that enhances, anything that promotes or preserves human happiness is good. And anything that detracts from human happiness, either by preventing happiness or causing unhappiness, is bad. And he goes further in the greatest happiness principle to say that, well, the happiness is the good, but happiness is pleasure. And unhappiness is really what we call the bad, and unhappiness is pain. So the good turns out to be pleasure. There's a long history in philosophy of that. It's called hedonism, as we'll see. Anything that says that the point of life is to experience as much enjoyment or pleasure as possible is by definition a hedonism. So utilitarianism, as we'll see, is a hedonism. And one of the most important things for Mill is to defend that, because some people may say, well, if you're saying that, the point of life, happiness, the good, is pleasure, then we're just animals. It's degrading. You're putting us at the level of pigs, basically. And so in chapter 2, which is a very important chapter, Mill's defense of that, defense of the idea that pleasure is the good, is a very important point for him. Very important for him to say that it's not degrading. And we'll see why. Basically because he says that there are different sorts of pleasures, and that the human pleasures are much different from the pleasures of a pig, and so on and so on. So that's a big issue in Mill's philosophy. As we'll see also in later readings, another big issue is proof of the principle of utility. Proof. What proof is there? What argument is there for the notion that happiness is the good? And this leads us into logic to some degree, the logic of philosophy, or how things, like first principles, can they actually be proved, and what what rational ground can be offered for things like the principle of utility. So the later chapters get into some very interesting things, and a lot of it really has to do, in Mill's mind, with what he regards as the kind of altruism or demandingness of the principle of utility, because it's quite important for Mill that our concern for happiness and pleasure is not purely selfish. Sure, any utilitarian will say that my happiness, my pleasure, and the avoidance of pain and unhappiness in my life is quite an important thing. But the greatest happiness principle, as Mill says, is very demanding insofar as it requires us to be neutral with regard to our own pleasures and pains, to take them into account, but not give them any privilege, in the sense that we don't regard them normally, or at least in themselves, as any more important than anyone else's. that we have to have a consciousness that our actions have effects on other people, and the effects on other people, all things considered, right, all things being equal, we have to regard as having equal importance. So this is really where the politics comes in to a large degree for Mill, because he believes that we have to all, in modern societies, get ourselves to the point where we have a social consciousness that enables this attitude where the actions that we engage in, the actions that maybe collectively we engage in politics and economics, that we have to have a fairly unselfish attitude, which is key for him. And really try to do things to improve social welfare and try to do things that avoid harming social welfare. So this is a very important thing for him. It's a wide-ranging book. It may not be, I think, as clear and helpful as Kant in terms of giving me a decision-making framework that will allow me to analyze situations and come up with possible answers to them. I don't think he is as good as Kant on that. But the book itself is really a classic expression of a utilitarian attitude, which you're able to. He's looking into mostly theoretical issues and problems having to do with the general utilitarian framework, but he's also thinking about modern history, and it's quite important. So that's what we'll be doing this week. Again, it's a reading week, and you're trying to familiarize yourself with Mill's book in preparation for an exam.